Most people live their lives without ever asking the most important question. Not because it is difficult, but because it is dangerous. The question sounds simple. Am I even going in the right direction? Not, is it working? Not, do I have enough money? Not, what will others think? But whether everything I do every day is actually leading where I'm supposed to go. Over the years, I kept seeing the same pattern. People could be intelligent, capable, hardworking. They could have a job, status, plans. But inside, there was almost always a strange feeling. As if life was passing them by. Not tragically. Not dramatically. Just, not in the right direction. The most dangerous thing about this state is that it looks normal. It is socially approved. It does not alarm anyone around you. And that is exactly why it is possible to remain stuck in it for decades. We are often told that purpose must be found. As if it is hidden somewhere. As if there is a correct answer that will one day reveal itself. But reality works differently. Purpose is not a sudden revelation. Not a talent. Not luck. It is a trajectory. Formed by decisions. Often small. Often unnoticed. But always repeated. History shows this very clearly. People who eventually found themselves in the right place rarely knew it in advance. But they almost always felt when they were moving against themselves. And they made a choice. Not the safest one. Not the most approved one. But an honest one. In relation to direction. Most people do the opposite. They choose stability over meaning. Comfort over direction. Explanations over decisions. And gradually they get used to a life in which everything seems correct. But nothing feels like it truly belongs to them. This book is not about how to quickly find your life's work. It is about something else. About why people lose direction. How the feeling of living someone else's life is formed. And what exactly must be structured differently for the path to begin feeling like your own again. Because sometimes the problem is not the choice of profession. It is that life has long been moving according to an architecture you never designed. And it is precisely from this understanding that real change begins. When I began exploring the idea of purpose, one thing struck me deeply. The further I went into history, the clearer it became. What today is called a crisis of meaning is not a new phenomenon at all. People have always asked themselves where they are going. The question simply sounded different in the past. In ancient civilizations, a person rarely asked, "Who am I?" They asked, "What place do I occupy?" This is a fundamentally different approach. In Babylon, one of the first cities with a complex social structure, a person did not search for purpose as a personal revelation. They understood themselves as part of a system. A merchant was a merchant not because he felt a passion for trade, but because he could see that his way of thinking, character, patience, and capacity for calculation matched that role. If a person tried to live outside their own internal logic, they did not become freer. They became useless. And society recognized this. In ancient Greece, the approach was subtler, but the essence remained the same. The Greeks spoke of logos, an inner law, by which both the person and the world move. Logos is not desire. And not talent in the modern sense. It is the alignment between a person's inner structure and the form of life they choose. A philosopher could be a craftsman. A warrior could be a thinker. But if the form of life contradicted one's logos, the person gradually began to break down from within. The Romans went even further. They introduced the concept of role. For a Roman, to lose one's role meant to lose oneself. A role was not a profession. but a way of being present in the world. A senator, a general, a landowner. Each understood that their task was not self-expression, but the precise fulfillment of what corresponded to their position, character, and time. When I compared this with modern life, the contrast was sharp. Today, a person can change professions, cities, relationships. They can be anything they want. And yet more and more often, they feel as though they are living someone else's life. The paradox is that there is more freedom, but less clarity. The modern person searches for purpose as an answer. The ancient person built it as a path. This is the key difference. We wait for clarity to arrive one day. They observed where their decisions were leading. We analyze feelings. They analyzed consequences. I began to notice a recurring pattern. People who feel that they are in their place rarely can explain exactly when or how they found it. But they can almost always say when they felt they were going in the wrong direction, and what they did with that feeling. Purpose does not disappear suddenly. It erodes. Through compromises. Through choosing to endure a little longer. Through decisions made not from direction, but from convenience. At first, this is almost unnoticeable. Then it becomes background noise. And eventually, normal. The ancients understood one simple thing. If a path is not aligned with a person's inner structure, no external success brings stability. You can be wealthy and lost. Respected and empty. Busy and inwardly motionless. When I studied biographies, from ancient philosophers to modern entrepreneurs, what surprised me was not how different they were. What surprised me was how similar their turning points were. Almost always, it was not triumph, but discomfort. Not failure, but a sense of misalignment. A person rarely changes direction because life is unbearable. More often, it happens because it becomes clear. This cannot continue. This book does not suggest searching for purpose through inspiration or dreams. It suggests looking at life as architecture, where every choice is not an emotion, but an element of construction. And if the structure leads in the wrong direction, the question is not what you are missing. The question is, according to what plan you are living. And this is where we will continue. With how people lose direction without noticing it. And why the ancient world was more attentive to this process than we are today. The more I studied ancient societies, the clearer one thing became. People did not lose their sense of direction suddenly. They lost it gradually, and almost always without noticing. What we call a crisis of purpose today would have sounded strange to them. Not because they were immune to doubt, but because their lives were structured in a way that made deviation visible early. Direction was not something abstract. It was embedded in daily life. In early civilizations, a person's path was shaped less by desire and more by alignment. The question was never, what do I want to become? It was, what role fits my nature, my abilities, and the needs of the city? This was not oppression. It was coherence. When a person acted against their disposition, the consequences were immediate and concrete. Loss of trust. Loss of usefulness. Loss of standing. Misalignment could not hide behind comfort. Over time, as societies grew more complex, the relationship between a person and their path began to change. In classical Athens, freedom expanded. But so did responsibility for direction. Citizens were no longer assigned a fixed place from birth. They had to choose. And with choice came a new risk. The risk of drifting. Greek thinkers understood this danger well. They spoke often of excess, imbalance, and loss of measure. A life without internal order was seen as unstable, no matter how successful it appeared on the surface. What protected people from long-term drift was not certainty, but feedback. When a life was misaligned, it showed. Through reputation. Through relationships. Through one standing in the polis. Today, many of these signals are delayed or muted. As I followed this pattern through history, I noticed a recurring shift. The more freedom societies gained, the more subtle the loss of direction became. In Rome, this reached a critical point. Roman life was built on roles, duties, and honor. But as the empire expanded, roles multiplied and blurred. Wealth increased. Mobility increased. And with it came a quiet erosion of clarity. People could live comfortably while slowly abandoning the logic that once guided them. This is where a crucial change occurred. Direction stopped being something lived, and became something explained. Instead of asking whether a path made sense, people began to justify it. They told themselves stories. Stories about necessity. About timing. About circumstance. These explanations softened discomfort. But they also delayed correction. The same mechanism is everywhere today. Modern life allows a person to function for years inside a misaligned structure. Income can mask dissatisfaction. Status can mask emptiness. Activity can mask stagnation. A person may appear successful while internally disconnected from their own movement. I began to see that loss of direction rarely feels dramatic. It feels reasonable. It often begins with a small compromise. I'll do this for now. This isn't perfect, but it's stable. I can always change later. None of these decisions feel wrong in isolation. But repeated over time, they form a pattern. Ancient societies understood something we tend to forget. Direction is not maintained by intention alone. It is maintained by structure. When structure weakens, intention becomes insufficient. In modern environments, structure is externalized. Institutions provide paths. Markets provide incentives. Culture provides narratives. All of these can support a person, or quietly redirect them. The danger is not choosing the wrong path once. The danger is staying on a path because it no longer produces immediate pain. I noticed that people who felt lost often struggled to explain why. There was no single mistake. No obvious failure. Just a growing sense that life was moving without them. This feeling is not confusion. It is misalignment becoming conscious. Ancient thinkers treated this state seriously. To live without direction was not a psychological issue. It was an ethical one. A person who did not know where they were going could not act responsibly. Not toward others, and not toward themselves. Modern culture reframes this experience. It medicalizes it. Distracts from it. Or romanticizes it. But the underlying issue remains unchanged. When a life lacks structure aligned with inner disposition, effort becomes heavier. And meaning thinner. What struck me most was this. People rarely stop and ask how their current path was designed. They assume it emerged naturally. But no structure emerges naturally. It is always built. Either consciously or by default. Ancient societies were explicit about this. Paths were named. Roles were defined. Expectations were clear. This reduced freedom, but preserved direction. Modern life reverses the equation. Freedom expands. Direction becomes ambiguous. And ambiguity, over time, produces drift. I began to understand that finding one's calling is the wrong question. The more accurate question is, what kind of structure is my life currently reinforcing? Because structure determines direction long before intention does. Loss of direction does not mean a person is incapable. It often means they are capable of many things. And therefore pulled in many directions. Without architecture, capability fragments. This is why ancient wisdom emphasized form over feeling. Measure over impulse. Order over enthusiasm. Not to suppress individuality, but to protect it from dispersion. Once this became clear, another realization followed naturally. If direction is lost gradually, it can only be restored deliberately. Not through inspiration, but through reconstruction. And that requires seeing clearly how one's current life is actually built. From here, the task is not to search for meaning, but to examine the hidden architecture that has been shaping decisions all along. That examination is uncomfortable, but it is the only point from which a true path can be rebuilt. At some point, I began to notice that most people do not consciously choose a path. They inherit it. Not from parents alone, but from environments, expectations, and invisible incentives that shape decisions long before reflection appears. A path rarely enters life as a clear directive. It arrives disguised as opportunity. In ancient societies, this disguise was harder to maintain. Paths were explicit. Roles were named. Deviations were visible. A person knew when they were stepping outside their place. Today, the opposite is true. Modern life offers countless paths that look equally acceptable. Each one promises stability, progress, or recognition. And because none of them appear wrong, the question of alignment is postponed. I began to see that the most dangerous paths are not those that lead to failure, but those that allow long-term functioning without fulfillment. They provide enough reward to suppress doubt, but not enough meaning to sustain inner coherence. Ancient thinkers warned about this state. In Greek philosophy, it was described as a life without measure. Not chaotic, but uncentered. Such a life could be productive, respected, and outwardly successful, yet internally fragmented. What fascinated me was how consistently this pattern reappeared across centuries. Whenever societies created environments where a person could advance without reflection, the same problem emerged. People mistook motion for direction. Modern systems are especially effective at this. They reward adaptability. They praise flexibility. They celebrate resilience. All valuable traits. But without a stable internal reference, these traits become tools of dispersion rather than focus. A person adapts to everything and belongs to nothing. I noticed that many people describe their lives as logical. They can explain why each step made sense at the time. They chose what was available, what was encouraged, what seemed reasonable. And yet, when asked where all of this leads, the answer is vague. Logic without orientation produces consistency, not purpose. Ancient cultures treated this condition with seriousness. To live a life assembled purely from reactions was seen as dangerous. Not morally wrong, but structurally unsound. Such a life could not endure pressure. Pressure reveals architecture. When circumstances change, when comfort fades, when recognition disappears, when routines break, a person discovers whether their path has depth or only momentum. This is often the moment when the feeling of "not my life" becomes impossible to ignore. I saw this repeatedly in modern contexts. People reached milestones they had worked toward for years, only to feel an unexpected emptiness. Not disappointment. Confusion. They had arrived somewhere, without knowing why they wanted to be there. This confusion is not a failure of gratitude. It is the recognition that the path was never truly owned. Ancient societies understood ownership differently. A path belonged to a person only if it demanded their character, not just their effort. but their disposition. Over time, I realized that many modern paths are designed to function independently of character. They require compliance, performance, endurance. But they do not require inner agreement. This allows a person to progress, while slowly disconnecting from themselves. The danger is subtle. Because progress continues, the internal warning signals are dismissed. Doubt is reframed as weakness, discomfort as impatience. And so the person adapts further, away from their original nature. Ancient wisdom treated this drift as reversible, but only if recognized early. The longer a path is followed without alignment, the more identity becomes entangled with it. Eventually, the question, "Is this my path?" threatens not just decisions, but self-image. This is why many avoid it. I began to see that reclaiming direction is less about discovering something new, and more about disentangling from what was never truly chosen. This requires honesty. Not dramatic honesty, but sustained attention to patterns. Which decisions were made repeatedly? Which alternatives were consistently dismissed? Which environments rewarded compliance over authenticity? These questions rarely have pleasant answers, but they clarify structure. Ancient societies emphasized apprenticeship, not because they limited freedom, but because they forced early confrontation with reality. A path revealed itself through practice, not imagination. Misalignment became visible quickly. Modern life delays this feedback. The longer feedback is delayed, the more effort is invested. And the more effort is invested, the harder it becomes to reconsider direction. This creates a trap, not of failure, but of sunk cost. I noticed that people who eventually realigned their lives did not do so because they found a better option. They did so because they stopped justifying the existing one. Justification dissolves clarity. Ancient thinkers warned against lives built on explanation rather than form. A form could be evaluated. An explanation could be endlessly adjusted. This difference matters. At this point, it became clear to me that reclaiming a sense of calling is not a matter of introspection alone. It requires structural awareness. One must see not only what feels wrong, but how the current life is assembled. Only then does change become possible without collapse. Direction is not restored by abandoning everything. It is restored by reordering. Removing what distorts. Reinforcing what aligns. This is slow work. But it is durable. The ancient world did not promise fulfillment. It promised coherence. And coherence, over time, produced a sense of belonging to one's own life. Once this distinction is understood, the next question becomes unavoidable. If paths are inherited, reinforced, and justified, what prevents people from noticing misalignment sooner? Why does awareness arrive so late? The answer lies not in intelligence, but in the way attention is trained and distributed. And that is where the architecture of calling reveals its next layer. The moment I began to focus on attention, many things fell into place. People do not lose their calling because they make a single wrong decision. They lose it because their attention is gradually trained to ignore direction altogether. Attention is the quiet architect of life. What it returns to, again and again, becomes reality. In ancient societies, attention was guarded carefully. Not because people were wiser by nature, but because distraction was limited. Life unfolded in visible cycles. Work, ritual, rest, and responsibility were clearly separated. This structure made deviation noticeable. A person could sense when their life was drifting, because the rhythm itself resisted incoherence. Modern life does the opposite. It dissolves rhythm. Days blur into each other. Work follows home. Distraction follows thought. Attention is constantly redirected toward urgency rather than meaning. And over time, this reshapes how decisions are made. I began to see that most people are not choosing paths at all. They are responding to stimuli. Messages. Deadlines. Expectations. Opportunities that arrive uninvited. Each response seems reasonable. Each decision feels justified. But none of them are evaluated in terms of direction. Ancient philosophers warned about this state. They described it as a life governed by externals. A life pulled rather than guided. Such a life could be productive. But it was never sovereign. What struck me was how clearly this applies today. Modern systems compete aggressively for attention. They reward immediacy. They punish reflection. Anything that does not produce an immediate outcome is treated as optional. Calling, by contrast, unfolds slowly. It requires sustained attention across time. This makes it incompatible with environments built on constant interruption. I noticed that people who felt lost rarely lacked insight. They lacked continuity of attention. They could reflect deeply for a moment, then return to reactive patterns for months. Insight without sustained attention has no structural impact. In ancient training systems, this was understood intuitively. Apprenticeship forced attention to remain focused on a single domain for years. Not to create specialization alone, but to allow alignment to emerge. A person discovered whether a path suited them by inhabiting it fully. Distraction was minimized. Feedback was immediate. Modern life fragments this process. People sample paths without committing. They collect experiences without integrating them. Attention hops from one possibility to another, never staying long enough for coherence to form. This creates a false sense of exploration. Movement without depth. I realize that attention shapes not only what we see, but what we consider real. If direction is rarely attended to, it becomes abstract. If urgency dominates attention, it becomes decisive. Over time, the hierarchy of values reverses. Ancient cultures placed meaning at the center of attention. Modern culture places efficiency. Efficiency is not wrong. But without orientation, it accelerates dispersion. I began to observe a pattern. The more a person's attention was consumed by external demands, the harder it became for them to sense misalignment. They could feel stress, fatigue, even frustration. But not direction. Direction requires quiet. Not silence. But unbroken continuity of focus. This is why moments of crisis often trigger clarity. When external noise collapses, attention returns inward. People suddenly see what had been invisible for years. Not because something new appeared, but because distraction temporarily vanished. Ancient societies did not rely on crisis for this clarity. They built it into structure. Rituals slowed attention. Boundaries limited choice. Repetition created depth. These were not spiritual practices alone. They were architectural tools. Modern life dismantles these tools. It offers infinite choice without hierarchy. Infinite information without synthesis. Attention becomes scattered. And with it, identity. I came to understand that reclaiming calling is inseparable from reclaiming attention. Not by forcing focus, but by redesigning the environment in which attention operates. This is not about willpower. It is about architecture. People often try to find their calling by asking more questions. But without attention, questions evaporate. They generate thought, but not movement. Ancient wisdom prioritized form over inquiry. Once form was right, answers followed naturally. I noticed that people who eventually realigned their lives did one thing consistently. They reduced the number of voices competing for their attention. They simplified input. They narrowed exposure. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Attention cannot serve many directions at once. When divided, it defaults to the loudest signal. Calling is rarely loud. It speaks through persistence, not urgency. This insight reframed everything for me. The problem was not that people could not hear their calling. It was that they had trained themselves not to listen. Once attention is restructured, another layer becomes visible. Even when clarity appears, people hesitate. Not because they do not see the path, but because stepping onto it carries cost. Social cost. Psychological cost. Temporal cost. This resistance is ancient as well. And understanding it is essential. Because without addressing that resistance, attention will eventually return to distraction. And the architecture will rebuild itself. Exactly as before. That resistance, subtle, rational, persistent, is where the next layer of calling reveals itself. Not as inspiration, but as courage. And that is where the deeper work begins. Clarity does not automatically lead to action. This was one of the most unsettling discoveries I made while studying both ancient lives and modern ones. People often know more than they are willing to admit. They sense misalignment. They recognize the gap between where they are and where they should be. And yet, they remain. Ancient cultures never assumed that seeing the right path was enough. They understood that direction always demanded sacrifice. To choose one form of life meant to renounce another. This was never framed as loss. But it was never denied. In modern language, we speak of fear of change. Ancient thinkers spoke of cost. Cost was not psychological. It was structural. To change direction meant to disrupt existing roles, break expectations, and accept uncertainty. This was considered inevitable. What struck me was how honestly this was treated. Ancient texts do not romanticize transformation. They describe it as difficult, isolating, and destabilizing. Yet necessary. A person who avoided cost was not judged as weak, but understood as choosing continuity over coherence. Modern life disguises cost. It reframes avoidance as patience, delay as strategy, inaction as prudence. This creates a false sense of responsibility. People believe they are being rational, when in fact they are preserving comfort. I noticed that most resistance to change does not come from fear of failure. It comes from fear of destabilizing identity. A person may tolerate dissatisfaction if it allows them to remain recognizable to themselves and others. Ancient societies placed less emphasis on personal identity as a fixed narrative. A person was defined by action and role, not by self-description. This made transition painful, but possible. Modern identity is more rigid. It is constructed through accumulated explanations. Changing direction threatens those explanations. I began to see that many people remain on misaligned paths, because leaving would require admitting that earlier decisions no longer make sense. This admission feels like erasure. But it is not. It is recalibration. Ancient thinkers treated recalibration as a sign of maturity. A person who adjusted their path in response to reality was considered wise, not inconsistent. Stubborn persistence was not admired. Correct alignment was. Modern culture reverses this valuation. Consistency is praised. Adaptation is admired only when it leads upward. Correction without visible gain is discouraged. This creates a trap. People wait for external justification to change. A crisis. A breakdown. An unavoidable disruption. Until then, they endure. I observed that those who eventually changed direction often did so quietly. Not dramatically. Not publicly. They began by withdrawing energy from what no longer fit. Less explanation. Less engagement. Less investment. This was not avoidance. It was preparation. Ancient practices often mirrored this process. Before major transitions, individuals were removed from normal life. Retreats. Exile. Periods of silence. Not to escape reality, but to weaken the grip of existing structure. Modern life offers few such spaces. Everything encourages continuation. Notifications. Schedules. Social reinforcement. Resistance is continuously reactivated. This made one thing clear to me. Change is not blocked by lack of knowledge. It is blocked by attachment. Attachment to image. Attachment to familiarity. Attachment to explanations that once felt necessary. Ancient wisdom did not condemn attachment. It contextualized it. Attachment was natural. But it was not authoritative. One's path did not serve attachment. Attachment served the path. I realized that reclaiming calling requires redefining what is being protected. Most people believe they are protecting stability. In reality, they are protecting continuity. Stability can be rebuilt. Continuity preserves form at any cost. The deeper cost of misalignment is not dissatisfaction. It is erosion. Over time, energy leaks. Attention weakens. Agency diminishes. A person becomes efficient but internally absent. Ancient thinkers warned against this state. They described it as living below one's measure. Not immoral. Not tragic. But incomplete. What they emphasized instead was commitment. Not to outcome, but to alignment. Commitment meant accepting cost up front, rather than paying erosion over decades. Once this became clear, another insight followed. People do not need courage to begin. They need courage to end. To end explanations. To end roles that no longer fit. To end narratives that once justified endurance. Ending is rarely celebrated. But it is often the most decisive act of alignment. Ancient societies honored rites of transition. For this reason, they marked endings publicly, so individuals would not carry them alone. Modern life offers no such markers. Endings are private, ambiguous, and easily postponed. This is why so many people remain suspended. They see the path, feel the cost, and wait for certainty. But certainty does not arrive before commitment. It follows it. At this point, the question of calling changes again. It is no longer about direction or attention. It becomes a question of threshold. What allows a person to cross from knowing into acting? What enables movement despite cost? That question cannot be answered through reasoning alone. It touches something deeper. And that is where the ancient understanding of discipline enters the picture. When ancient thinkers spoke about discipline, they did not mean control. They meant containment. This distinction matters more than it seems. Modern discipline is often framed as pressure. Forcing oneself to act despite resistance. Ancient discipline was understood as form. A structure that makes the right action easier and the wrong one harder. I realize that most people fail not because they lack willpower, but because their lives are built in ways that constantly oppose their intentions. They try to move forward inside architectures designed to keep them stationary. No amount of motivation can overcome that for long. In the ancient world, discipline was not personal heroism. It was environmental design. Training systems, daily rhythms, and social expectations were constructed to support alignment. A person did not rely on inspiration to remain on a path. They relied on form. Stoic philosophers were explicit about this. They warned against depending on mood or desire. Not because emotions were bad, but because they were unstable. A life built on instability could not sustain direction. What struck me was how practical their approach was. Discipline meant narrowing life until it matched capacity. Not doing more, but doing less, deliberately. Fewer commitments. Clearer priorities. Repeatable actions. This reduced friction. Modern culture celebrates expansion. More options. More stimulation. More ambition. But expansion without form produces fragility. Ancient thinkers saw this clearly. They understood that strength emerges from limitation. I noticed that people who successfully crossed the threshold into aligned lives did not become more intense. They became more contained. Their days grew simpler. Their commitments fewer. Their actions more consistent. This was not minimalism as a trend, but as necessity. Ancient training emphasized repetition. Not because novelty was distrusted, but because repetition revealed truth. A path that could not be sustained daily was not a true path. Calling had to survive ordinary time. Modern life makes this difficult. It rewards bursts of effort and visible results. It punishes slow, quiet consistency. As a result, people mistake intensity for progress. They burn energy without building structure. I began to understand why so many attempts at change collapse. People try to leap into new identities without redesigning the systems that support daily life. They change goals, but not schedules. Values, but not environments. Discipline is supposed to bridge that gap. Ancient discipline was not moral. It was logistical. It asked practical questions. What must be removed? What must be repeated? What must be protected? These questions had clear answers. Modern discussions of calling rarely address this layer. They focus on meaning, but ignore mechanics. This creates fragile transformations. People feel inspired, but unsupported. I observed that ancient paths were rarely dramatic. They were quiet, steady, and often unimpressive from the outside. But they endured. The architecture held. This led me to a critical realization. Calling is not something you step into once. It is something you maintain. And maintenance requires discipline. Not as force, but as form. When discipline is absent, calling degrades into fantasy. It becomes something imagined, talked about, planned for, but never inhabited. Ancient societies had little patience for this. They valued embodiment over articulation. I noticed that people often resist discipline because they associate it with loss of freedom. Ancient thinkers saw it differently. They believed discipline preserved freedom by protecting direction from impulse. Freedom without form leads to drift. Form without freedom leads to rigidity. The balance between the two was considered the art of living. At this stage, it became clear that discipline alone was not enough. Even with structure, people could still misdirect themselves. Form could sustain a path, but not guarantee it was the right one. This raised another question. How did ancient societies evaluate whether a path was worth sustaining? What criteria did they use to distinguish endurance from stubbornness? They did not rely on satisfaction. They relied on measure. Measure is a concept largely forgotten today. But without it, discipline becomes blind. And that blindness creates its own form of misalignment. Understanding measure is essential, because it determines when discipline should be reinforced, and when it should be questioned. Without it, people either quit too early, or persist too long. Both lead away from calling. This realization pointed toward the next layer. Calling is not only about commitment and discipline. It is about proportion. About knowing when effort aligns. And when it merely continues. Ancient wisdom treated this distinction with precision. Recovering it changes everything. The ancient idea of measure changed the way I understood effort. Until then, I believed, as many do, that the main problem of modern life was inconsistency. That people quit too early. That they lacked perseverance. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Many people do not fail because they stop too soon. They fail because they continue too long in the wrong proportion. Ancient thinkers treated measure as a form of intelligence. Not calculation. But discernment. Measure was the ability to sense when an action still served alignment. And when it merely preserved momentum. This distinction was considered essential to a well-ordered life. In Greek philosophy, measure was tied to the concept of sophrosyne, moderation rooted in awareness. Not restraint for its own sake. But harmony between effort, capacity, and direction. A person without measure was not immoral. They were dangerous to themselves. What struck me was how often modern culture confuses endurance with virtue. We admire those who persist endlessly. Who tolerate imbalance. Who push past every signal. But ancient wisdom treated this as blindness. Effort without proportion was seen as wasteful. Even destructive. I began to notice how frequently people misuse discipline. They apply it indiscriminately. They double down on paths that no longer respond. They increase effort where correction is needed. This feels responsible. It looks admirable. But it is often misaligned. Ancient training systems were built to prevent this. Progress was evaluated not only by output, but by coherence. Did effort produce stability? Did it preserve vitality? Did it deepen skill? If not, persistence was questioned. Modern systems rarely ask these questions. They measure growth. But not direction. They reward visibility. But not proportion. This trains people to confuse accumulation with advancement. I observed that people who burned out were often highly disciplined. They followed routines. They met obligations. They sustained pressure. What they lacked was not effort, but measure. They had lost the ability to evaluate whether their discipline still served alignment. Ancient thinkers warned against this explicitly. They described lives consumed by excess. Not excess of pleasure, but excess of effort. Such lives appeared noble, but were internally disordered. Measure required regular interruption. Pauses were not signs of weakness. They were tools of assessment. Without pauses, effort became self-reinforcing. Momentum replaced judgment. Modern life discourages pause. Stopping is framed as hesitation. Reflection as inefficiency. As a result, people rarely reassess their trajectory. They keep moving. Until something breaks. I began to understand that calling cannot survive blind persistence. A path must respond. It must deepen skill. Strengthen identity. And preserve vitality. When these elements erode, measure demands adjustment. Ancient societies institutionalized this. Festivals interrupted labor. Seasons structured work. Aging shifted roles. Life was designed to change proportionally over time. Modern life flattens these distinctions. Everything becomes continuous. This creates a dangerous illusion. People believe they are progressing because they are busy. But busyness without measure creates exhaustion without meaning. I noticed that those who realigned successfully developed a refined sense of proportion. They did not ask, "Can I continue?" They asked, "Does continuing still make sense?" This is a harder question. It threatens identity. Ancient wisdom treated this threat as necessary. Identity was not something to be protected at all costs. It was something to be refined. Measure also applied to ambition. Ancient thinkers did not condemn ambition. But they insisted it match nature. Ambition exceeding capacity produced instability. Ambition below capacity produced stagnation. The task was alignment, not maximization. Modern culture promotes maximization relentlessly. More income. More reach. More influence. But maximization without measure leads to dispersion. Calling becomes diluted. I realize that measure is what allows discipline to remain intelligent. Without it, discipline becomes compulsion. Effort continues. Long after meaning has left. This insight reframed many modern struggles. Burnout was not a failure of resilience. It was a failure of proportion. Confusion was not lack of clarity. It was excess without direction. Ancient thinkers believed that a well-measured life felt quiet. Not easy. But stable. Effort fit capacity. Progress felt grounded. This stability allowed calling to endure over decades. Modern life rarely offers this feeling. It oscillates between intensity and collapse. This rhythm exhausts attention and obscures direction. I began to see that restoring calling requires restoring measure. Not reducing ambition, but recalibrating it. Not quitting discipline, but refining it. Measure asks uncomfortable questions. Is this effort still generative? Does it deepen or merely sustain? Am I continuing because it aligns? Or because stopping would require reconsideration? These questions have no quick answers. But they prevent years of misdirected persistence. Ancient wisdom treated these questions as central. They were asked repeatedly. Through ritual, reflection, and communal feedback. Modern life isolates individuals from such feedback. This makes measure harder. But more necessary. Once measure is restored, a subtle change occurs. Effort becomes lighter. Attention stabilizes. Identity consolidates. Calling begins to feel inhabitable. Not aspirational. At this point, another layer becomes visible. Even with discipline and measure, a path can remain fragile. Because modern life does not test calling gradually. It tests it suddenly. Through disruption. Through loss. Through change beyond control. Ancient thinkers prepared for this as well. They understood that no calling is secure unless it can withstand instability. And that understanding leads to the next layer of architecture. One of the most overlooked aspects of calling is its relationship with instability. Ancient thinkers never assumed that a path, once found, would remain intact. They expected disruption, loss, change, external forces beyond control. Calling was not meant to eliminate instability. It was meant to survive it. This is where ancient wisdom becomes particularly relevant. Modern discussions of purpose often assume stable conditions. They imagine a path unfolding smoothly, supported by consistency and predictability. History offers no such illusion. Every civilization understood that life would interfere. In ancient societies, this reality shaped preparation. People were trained not only for success, but for loss. Not pessimistically, but structurally. A calling that depended entirely on external stability was considered fragile. Stoic thinkers articulated this with clarity. They distinguished between what belonged to a person and what merely passed through their life. Reputation, position, wealth. All were considered external. A calling anchored in externals was vulnerable by definition. What surprised me was how calmly this was treated. There was no drama in the acknowledgement of loss. It was not framed as tragedy, but as inevitability. The question was never, will this be taken away? But, what remains when it is? I began to notice how modern lives are often built in reverse. People anchor identity, meaning, and direction to conditions that cannot be controlled. Careers, markets, social recognition. When these shift, the entire sense of purpose collapses. This is not weakness. It is architecture. Ancient societies designed paths differently. A role could change, but character was expected to remain. A position could be lost, but orientation endured. Calling was not attached to circumstances, but to disposition. I saw this pattern repeatedly. People who maintained direction through disruption did not cling to outcomes. They adapted form, without abandoning essence. This ability was not improvised in crisis. It was cultivated long before. Ancient training emphasized internal reference points. Values that did not fluctuate with success. Principles that survived loss. These were not abstractions. They were rehearsed. Through reflection. Through exposure to controlled adversity. Through philosophical practice. Modern life offers few such rehearsals. Comfort is normalized. Disruption is treated as anomaly. As a result, when instability arrives, people experience it as betrayal. Not of circumstance, but of identity. I realize that many modern crises of calling are not about direction at all. They are about collapse of dependency. A person loses what they relied on to feel oriented. Without that support, the path disappears. Ancient wisdom sought to prevent this. Not by avoiding attachment, but by ranking it. What was essential was protected. What was contingent was acknowledged as temporary. This hierarchy preserved direction under pressure. I observed that people who rebuilt their lives after disruption did not search for a new calling immediately. They first stabilized their internal structure. They asked different questions. What remains consistent? What still demands expression? What kind of effort still feels coherent? Only then did form re-emerge. Ancient thinkers described this as returning to first principles. Not starting over, but stripping away what was never fundamental. This process was uncomfortable, but clarifying. Modern culture often encourages rapid replacement. Lose one role, adopt another. Lose one identity, construct a new one. This speed prevents integration. It recreates dependency under a new name. I began to understand why ancient paths emphasized endurance of character. Character was the only element that could cross disruptions intact. Calling rooted in character could be reshaped without being erased. This does not mean that loss is easy. Ancient texts acknowledge grief, but they distinguish grief from disorientation. Grief passes. Disorientation persists. Unless structure is restored. I noticed that people who retained calling through instability did not define themselves by what they did. They defined themselves by how they engaged. This subtle difference allowed continuity. Ancient societies treated this as essential preparation. Youth was not only trained for achievement, but for loss of achievement. This prepared individuals to adapt without collapse. Modern life rarely prepares for this. Success is emphasized. Failure is stigmatized. This imbalance creates brittle identities. I realize that calling cannot depend on permanence. Any path that requires conditions to remain unchanged will eventually fail. This is not pessimism. It is realism. Calling must be portable. It must travel across roles, contexts, and phases of life. Ancient wisdom treated this as obvious. Modern life has forgotten it. Once this layer became clear, the nature of calling shifted again. It was no longer about choosing the right activity. It was about cultivating a center that could guide activity under any condition. This center was not emotional. It was structural. It consisted of values, capacities, and forms of engagement that remained intact under pressure. Understanding this explains why some people emerge from disruption clearer than before. Loss strips away false structures. What remains reveals the true architecture. But this only works if a person has something internal to return to. Without that, instability produces only confusion. Ancient wisdom insisted on this preparation. Not to harden people, but to stabilize them. Calling was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be resilient. At this point, one final layer becomes visible. If calling must survive attention, cost, discipline, measure, and instability, what ultimately defines its authenticity? What distinguishes a path that merely functions from one that truly belongs? Ancient thinkers answered this without hesitation. They pointed not to success, but to integration. And that is where the architecture of calling finds its completion. When ancient thinkers spoke about a fulfilled life, they did not describe happiness. They described integration. This distinction is critical. A person could be content yet fragmented, successful yet divided, active yet internally scattered. Integration was something else. Integration meant that the parts of a life did not contradict one another. Effort aligned with values. Roles aligned with character. Daily actions reinforced long-term direction. A person did not need to explain themselves constantly. Their life made sense on its own. I realized that this was the final criterion ancient societies used to evaluate a path. Not pleasure. Not recognition. Not even endurance. But coherence. Did the life hold together under scrutiny? Modern culture rarely asks this question. It evaluates outcomes separately. Career here. Relationships there. Personal values somewhere else. As long as each area functions, fragmentation is tolerated. Ancient wisdom rejected this separation. For them, fragmentation was not neutral. It was unstable. A divided life required constant compensation. Energy was spent managing contradictions instead of deepening direction. I began to notice how often people described their lives in compartments. I'm one person at work. Another with friends. A different one alone. This adaptability is praised. But ancient thinkers saw danger in it. Too many masks weaken identity. Integration does not eliminate complexity. It organizes it. Different roles remain. But they answer to the same internal center. This center is what ancient wisdom treated as essential. In Roman philosophy, this was expressed through the idea of constantia, inner steadiness. Not rigidity, but consistency of character across circumstances. A person could change positions, but not principles. I observed that people who felt deeply aligned rarely spoke about purpose explicitly. They spoke about fit. This feels right. This makes sense. I can live this way. These were not emotional claims. They were structural observations. Integration produces a distinctive feeling. Not excitement. Not certainty. But calm. A calm that emerges when effort no longer fights identity. Ancient societies understood this calm as strength. A person who was integrated did not need constant reassurance. They could withstand ambiguity because their internal reference remained intact. Modern life often misunderstands this calm. It confuses it with stagnation. But ancient thinkers saw the opposite. Calm signaled alignment. I began to understand why many modern lives feel exhausting. Not because they demand too much, but because they demand contradiction. People act against their values, justify against their intuition, and endure against their nature. This constant friction drains energy. Integration removes unnecessary resistance. It does not make life easy, but it makes effort efficient. Energy flows toward construction, not repair. Ancient training emphasized this outcome. Not specialization, but synthesis. A person was encouraged to become whole, not merely skilled. I noticed that when people approached integration, certain changes occurred naturally. They explained less. They defended less. They compared themselves less. Their lives no longer required constant validation. This is why integration is difficult. It removes many social rewards. Approval often comes from performance, not coherence. An integrated life may appear quieter, less impressive, but it endures. Ancient thinkers valued endurance over applause. They believed that a life should be able to sustain itself without constant reinforcement. Calling, in this sense, was not something to be pursued. It was something to be inhabited. I realized that many people fail to recognize calling because they look for intensity. Ancient wisdom looked for stability. A calling that oscillates wildly was considered immature. One that remained inhabitable over time was respected. Integration also clarified decision-making. Choices no longer required exhaustive analysis. They were evaluated against internal coherence. Does this action deepen alignment? Or does it introduce contradiction? This simplified life dramatically. Modern culture often celebrates complexity. Ancient wisdom respected clarity. Clarity was not simplicity of thought, but unity of direction. As I reflected on this, it became clear why integration was treated as the final layer. Attention enables awareness. Cost tests commitment. Discipline creates form. Measure refines effort. Resilience protects against instability. But only integration confirms authenticity. Without integration, a path may function without belonging. With integration, even modest paths feel substantial. This understanding reframed success entirely. Success was not accumulation. It was coherence sustained across time. Ancient societies did not expect everyone to live remarkable lives. They expected people to live aligned ones. Remarkability emerged occasionally. Alignment was the standard. I realized that the modern obsession with standing out often comes from standing apart from oneself. Integration dissolves that tension. At this point, the architecture of calling becomes complete. Not as a destination, but as a way of inhabiting life. Yet one final question remains. If calling is integrated, how does it continue evolving? How does a person grow without fragmenting again? Ancient wisdom addressed this as well. Not through reinvention, but through continuity of refinement. And that is where the closing layer of calling begins. One of the most persistent modern misunderstandings about calling is the belief that growth requires reinvention. That to evolve, one must abandon what already exists. Change direction. Start over. Ancient thinkers saw growth differently. They believed that true development did not come from replacing a path, but from deepening it. This idea initially felt counterintuitive to me. Modern culture celebrates novelty, new beginnings, fresh identities. Staying with one path is often interpreted as stagnation. But ancient wisdom treated continuity as strength. In classical philosophy, growth was described as refinement. Not expansion outward, but clarification inward. A person did not become someone else. They became more themselves. I began to see how often modern lives fracture under the pressure to reinvent. People abandon paths not because they are wrong, but because they have not yet yielded visible reward. Impatience masquerades as evolution. Ancient societies understood time differently. They expected mastery to unfold over decades. A path that did not mature quickly was not considered flawed. It was considered normal. This long horizon protected calling from impulsive change. A person could endure periods of obscurity because they trusted the trajectory. Growth was evaluated across years, not moments. I noticed that people who sustained alignment over long periods rarely made dramatic shifts. Instead, their lives showed subtle progression. Responsibilities changed. Expressions evolved. Depth increased. But the core remained recognizable. Ancient thinkers described this as continuity of essence. The form adapted. The essence persisted. This allowed growth without fragmentation. Modern life often lacks this continuity. Career paths are interrupted. Identities are revised. Values are rebranded. Each change promises renewal, but often produces disorientation. I began to see that calling does not require constant validation. It requires patience. Patience not as passivity, but as trust in accumulated effort. Ancient training emphasized patience explicitly. Students were not rushed. Progress was measured by steadiness, not speed. A person was not considered late, simply because their impact had not yet materialized. Modern environments rarely support this. They reward visible output. They penalize quiet preparation. This pressures people to alter direction prematurely. I observed that many who abandoned their paths did so just before depth emerged. They mistook the plateau for a dead end. Ancient wisdom warned against this error. Plateaus were seen as integration phases. Moments when learning settled into structure. Growth without plateaus was considered unstable. Too much novelty prevented consolidation. Calling requires periods of stillness to transform effort into capability. I realize that this explains much modern restlessness. People move because they have not allowed their path to fully inhabit them. They have acted, but not integrated. Ancient societies protected integration deliberately. Apprentices remained with mentors long after basic competence. Not to extract more labor, but to absorb form. Form could not be rushed. Modern independence often interrupts this process. People separate from structure before internal stability develops. This creates perpetual beginners. I noticed that mature callings felt quiet. They did not demand attention. They did not require constant affirmation. They generated their own sense of rightness. Ancient thinkers saw this as a sign of alignment. Growth, in this view, was incremental. A deepening of judgment. A refinement of effort. An expansion of responsibility. Not a replacement of identity. This reframed how I understood ambition. Ancient ambition was not about reaching higher positions. It was about sustaining greater weight. More responsibility. More consequence. More coherence. Modern ambition often emphasizes visibility. Ancient ambition emphasized capacity. The ability to hold complexity without losing direction. I began to understand why some people seem to grow endlessly without appearing restless. They were not chasing novelty. They were working within a structure that allowed indefinite refinement. Calling, then, was not a phase of life. It was a mode of engagement. A way of relating to effort, time, and responsibility. This understanding removes urgency. Not because time is infinite, but because direction is stable. A person no longer feels pressured to prove alignment through change. Ancient wisdom valued this stability. They believed a life should deepen, not constantly reset. This allowed calling to mature into wisdom. I noticed that people who reached this stage often stopped asking, "Is this my calling?" The question no longer made sense. Calling was no longer a concept. It was lived. At this point, the architecture of calling feels complete. Attention is reclaimed. Cost is accepted. Discipline forms structure. Measure refines effort. Resilience sustains direction. Integration confirms authenticity. Continuity enables growth. One final layer remains. Not to explain calling, but to place it within a life as a whole. Because even the most aligned path exists inside a finite existence. Ancient wisdom never separated calling from mortality. They believed that understanding limits was essential to living well. And that understanding brings the entire architecture into focus. The ancient world never separated calling from finitude. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable difference between their thinking and ours. Modern culture speaks endlessly about potential. Ancient wisdom spoke quietly about limits. Not to diminish life, but to clarify it. Ancient thinkers believed that a life only becomes intelligible when it is seen as finite. Without limits, direction dissolves. If everything is possible, nothing is necessary. I noticed that many modern struggles around calling emerge from the refusal to accept boundaries. People want certainty without commitment. Growth without exclusion. Meaning without sacrifice. Ancient wisdom rejected this fantasy. A path was meaningful precisely because it excluded others. In Stoic philosophy, the awareness of death was not morbid. It was orienting. To remember that time is limited was to prioritize coherence over accumulation. What mattered was not how much one did, but whether what was done aligned with one's nature. This perspective changes everything. Decisions are no longer evaluated by comparison, but by congruence. Does this belong in the life I am actually living? Does it deepen the path I have chosen? Or merely fill time? I began to see how often modern life avoids this question. People postpone alignment by imagining infinite revision. I'll adjust later. I can always change. There's still time. Ancient thinkers did not deny the possibility of change. But they did not rely on endless postponement. Time was treated as weight. Every decision added structure. Finitude made architecture unavoidable. A life could not remain provisional forever. Eventually, it hardened into form. Ancient wisdom encouraged people to take responsibility for that process early. I observed that people who lived with a sense of finitude made different choices. They did not rush. But they did not drift. They accepted trade-offs without resentment. They understood that depth requires exclusion. Modern culture often frames exclusion as loss. Ancient wisdom framed it as definition. A path became clear. Not by adding options, but by refusing distractions. I realized that this reframes freedom entirely. Freedom was not the absence of constraint. It was the ability to commit without regret. Ancient thinkers believed that regret came not from limitation, but from incoherence. A life aligned with calling could be lived fully, even if it remained modest. A life misaligned felt empty, even when abundant. This distinction mattered more than success. Finitude also clarified responsibility. If life is limited, then attention is precious. Where attention goes repeatedly is where life goes. Ancient wisdom treated this as obvious. Modern life obscures it. I noticed that when people truly accepted limits, their anxiety softened. They stopped scanning for alternatives. They stopped comparing trajectories. They focused on inhabiting what they had chosen. This produced presence. Ancient thinkers saw presence as the highest form of engagement. To be fully where one is was considered rare and valuable. Calling was inseparable from this capacity. At this stage, the architecture of calling closes in on itself. Not as a system to follow, but as a way to live. Attention grounds awareness. Cost clarifies commitment. Discipline creates form. Measure refines effort. Resilience protects against instability. Integration confirms coherence. Continuity allows growth. Finitude gives meaning. Nothing here promises ease. Ancient wisdom never did. But it promised alignment. An alignment, sustained over time, produced a quiet form of fulfillment. That did not depend on recognition. I realized that the question, "Have I found my calling?" was the wrong one. A better question is simpler. Am I living in a way that I can continue without betraying myself? This question does not require inspiration. It requires honesty. Ancient societies placed great value on this honesty. Not as confession, but as orientation. A person who lived aligned did not need to justify their life. Their life justified itself. This is not a conclusion in the usual sense. Calling does not end. It stabilizes. It deepens. It becomes the background against which life unfolds. What remains is not certainty, but clarity. Not excitement, but steadiness. Not answers, but direction. Ancient wisdom believed that this was enough. A life did not need to be extraordinary to be complete. It needed to be coherent. If this book has done its work, it has not given you a path. It has helped you see how paths are built, maintained, and preserved. What you do with that understanding belongs to you. Architecture does not decide how you will live. It reveals what your life is already becoming. And once that is visible, the responsibility and the freedom are unavoidable.